All right, so today is February 20th. It's about 1 p.m. We're here in the Judaica suite with Dr. Larry Rivers. My name is Ronan Hart with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I'm joined by
Dr. Alyssa Cole. I'm with the African American Studies Program and the History Department at UF.
Yeah, and we're here today to talk with Dr. Rivers about the Underground Railroad in Florida. So, well, first, Dr. Rivers, do you just want to introduce yourself, what you do now?
Yes. My name is Larry E. Rivers. I am Distinguished Professor of History at the Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida, and I've been teaching at Florida A&M for over 30 years, and I am really happy to be a part of this interview on the Underground Railroad.
All right. So to get started, how do you remember African American history being taught to you when you were a child in school?
Well, I think I need to add a little perspective before I give you an answer to that. I was born and reared in Philadelphia. Well, a little place outside of Philadelphia called Sharon Hill. And from the first to the sixth grade, I attended a segregated school. Up north, segregated school. And from the 7th to the 12th, it was an integrated school. But even from first to sixth grade, I knew nothing about African American history. My teachers did not teach anything about African American history. I didn't know anything about Florida. It seems like what was taught was about northeastern history, about the history of Boston, the history of Pennsylvania, the history of New Hampshire. But Southern history or history of the West, we were not exposed to. So when I got to high school, we started learning about African American history, but it was a limited, very limited perspective. For example, we would talk about Booker T. Washington, we would talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, and we would even talk up to Martin Luther King, but talking about the institution of slavery was not a part of the discussion in my high school. Where I learned about the institution of slavery was from my mother, Livonia. She would read I'm one of 8 siblings. And she would read to us, and she would search up and down, because during the 1950s and 60s, it was hard to find books on the African American experience. But she taught us a lot at home by reading. And that's where I got interested in history from my mother. And I said, one day I'm gonna be a history teacher. She said, that's good, son, because we need history teachers to talk about all aspects of the American experience. And so I was inspired by my mother to become a history teacher. And then from high school, I went on to graduate school and to become now a historian.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember what any of the books were that inspired you?
Well, one of the books that inspired me was Benjamin Quarles, the Negro in the Making of America. Another book, it went through a lot of edition, was From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin. These were some standard books, and my mother would read different chapters, and she would break it down to us as to what some of the concepts and events meant. And so I was really interested in reading the history of the African American experience. But what I was also interested in was to see if I could find books by African Americans who wrote about the African American experience. What I was basically exposed to were subjects like, for example, the great presidents, the westward movement, but the westward movement without the interplay of Native Americans, indigenous population. And my mother was really, I think she was ahead of her time. She really said, you need to look at everything. And I didn't know what she meant by that. But over time, I understood that in order to be a historian, you need to look at all aspects of American history.
Mm-hmm. How about the Underground Railroad? Did that come up at home or in school?
The Underground Railroad came up at home and not at all in school. Mm-hmm. And bless my mother's heart, she knew basically about the Underground Railroad that went from the South to the North into Canada. She knew about Harriet Tubman, but that was the extent. But it really piqued my interest in the Underground Railroad. And so when I became a professor at Florida A&M, I got interested in researching the Underground Railroad. But I was a little interested in looking at the Underground Railroad from a different perspective. Florida complicates the picture of the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. And in my book, Rebels and Runaways, I focus on this complicated situation between what we normally consider the Underground Railroad going from the South to the North into Canada. And my research suggests, particularly after the mid-1830s, when the British emancipated a lot of the indigenous people in the Bahamas, I looked at the Underground Railroad not going from the South to the North, but from the South Florida, further south into the Bahamas. And my book, Rebels and Runaways, focused on fugitives who left, for example, St. Augustine, boarding ships, going to the Bahamas, going to Miami, boarding ships, boats, going to the Bahamas. And I said, well, this is very interesting. And there were instances where the Americans tried to get them back, but because slavery was outlawed, they found it very hard to get them back. So I felt that this was an aspect of the Underground Railroad that needed to be discussed, needed to be read about. And so if you look at my book, it really focuses particularly not on the Underground Railroad going from Florida to Canada, because think about it. If you start in Florida, you got to go to Georgia, you got to go to South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. I mean, you had all these states to go through. But after 1837, when the British outlawed slavery in the Bahamas, you could get a boat in St. Mark's, you could get a boat in St. Augustine, you could get a boat in Miami, you could try, and if you knew anything about navigating, you could probably get a boat in Pensacola, all these places. And the thing that I truly believe that enslaved people knew about that some enslaved people did not, say in Virginia and North Carolina, was that enslaved people in Florida had what I called an Atlantic world perspective. They knew that there were places they could become free if they traveled the Atlantic Ocean. They knew that coming from West Africa into the Caribbean, into the Americas, but they also knew that there were places in between, given the time of emancipation, that they could go back. And so when these enslaved people boarded boats, they took that information with them to talk to others. So I think Florida enslaved blacks had a greater Atlantic world perspective than, say, your slaves in Mississippi or your slaves even in Texas and other places. So the Underground Railroad played a dynamic role in Florida, but not only Florida, and I know that you're talking about Florida in particular, But during about the same time when the Spanish outlawed slavery in Mexico, a lot of enslaved people, particularly in Texas and other places, went into Mexico around the Rio Grande, and they were set free. They said it was tough, and that some of the writers, depending on who was doing the writing, said that it was so rough in Mexico that enslaved fugitives went back into Texas, and I didn't find, in my reading, I did not find that. They fared, from what I gather in my limited research, and I'm still looking at this, they fared pretty, fugitives, runaways fared pretty good in Mexico. So when we look at the traditional Underground Railroad, it is much more complex than what a lot of people realize. I mean, I call it the triangle effect. You had enslaved fugitives running from the south to the north. You had enslaved people going from Florida further south into the Bahamas. You had enslaved people leaving places like Georgia, Texas, Florida, trying to find their way into Mexico. So I think that there is so much more that we can do to discover all the complexities of the overall Underground Railroad that most people today don't know anything about.
Well, since we're getting into Rebels and Runaways, I really wanted to ask you about the research process for it, because it feels like such an exhaustive, all-encompassing book. And you were saying earlier it took years. And I especially want to hear about the role of oral history in it, because I saw written that oral history played a part in your research.
I tell you, the Rebels and Runaway book almost made me give up doing research at all. Oh my God. It was a tremendous task to find information, but right here, the P.K. Young Library was instrumental in me finding important information. Some of the early newspapers, the Tallahassee Weekly, the Jacksonville Republican, all had articles about runaways and where they thought that they were heading. They would leave, for example, St. Augustine and then end up in the Bahamas, and they wanted them to be sent back. And so I searched high and low, and one resource that I found most helpful were the slave narratives. I went through all the slave narratives, not just the one particularly on Florida. I went through them because I would find some instances, say, in the Georgia narratives where a former enslaved person settled in Georgia, but had most of their life experiences in Florida. And they talked about escaping, and they talked about getting into places like the Bahamas. So I searched high and low, but I also have a friend who has co-written books with me named Dr. Canner Brown Jr. He introduced me to a lot of this research. I think he has a library at his house that's second to none. And he also helped me and directed me to resources that helped me to complete my book on Rebels and Runaways. So it was a laborious task, but it was a task that I really loved doing. It took a while, and I was frustrated at times. Sources were hard to find at times, but I knew that if I kept at it, that I could write a book that would be of interest, hopefully, to the reader.
Yeah, it was.
Well, thank you.
For me, at least.
Thank you.
And from that, the story of Daddy Corporal Jaudan, who lived 117 years. Jaudan.
Yes.
Excuse me, Jaudan, who was 117 years old when he passed away after the Civil War. How did you find that story? And is there anything about it that wasn't in the book?
I found that story through my colleague, Dr. Brown. He said, I think you need to look at this. Jardin was a very interesting individual. As you stated, he was 117 years old when he passed. At least that's what the record suggested. And I was led to him by my colleague, Dr. Canner Brown, Jr., and he showed me several newspaper articles, and not only of Jardin, but Molly, who was very old. And the unique thing about Corporal Jardin is that he remembered his experiences traveling the Atlantic Ocean. He remembered his experiences from the Gullah tribe in Ghana, going from West Africa across the Middle Passage into Charleston, and then once in Charleston, being sold and living the rest of his life in Jacksonville. And he talks about his experience. But what I found so interesting about his particular story is that he remembered a lot of the traditions that he tried to preserve once he landed in the Americas, particularly in the United States. He felt that it was important to try to remember the language, the religion, and while we don't know a whole lot, it just indicated that he did not want to forget some of the memories of his homeland for the new homeland in Charleston and then Jacksonville.
That was a bunch of questions for me. Do you have anything you want to jump in with?
So I want to go back a little bit to, you mentioned your mother and your mother introducing you to this history. That's a concept that I think is pretty common when you were talking about African American history. That's my own story. Why do you think that is? And was that common was that a common occurrence amongst your peers when you were growing up, for their parents to be teaching them this history? And why has that continued to be the case, that our parents have to teach us this history in order for us to learn it?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I actually live with every day. If it had not been for my mother, who died very early, she died at 59. She raised 8 children along with my father, who was a barber. I don't think I would have been interested in history, because the way that it was taught in high school was taught by dates, times, no cause and effect. They didn't tell a story. They didn't relate it to anything that made sense in my life. And Mom would read it, and then she would turn around and tell the story and fit the facts and whatnot. And it made it so interesting. We did not, and that was the advent of television early in the 50s and 60s. We didn't care much about television. If we could get Mom to read a story and then to reinterpret it so that we could truly understand, that was so enlightening. And most of the parents in the community did the same thing, because they knew that their children were not receiving the history of the African American experience. And we always would come home, my brothers and sisters, say, Mom, they talked about this today, but based upon you, black folk didn't do anything during that time. They talked about, Mom, World War II, but they said that there were no black pilots. She knew back then about the Tuskegee. We know much more today, but she said there were guys from Tuskegee who flew. I said, Mama, I never heard of that. She could have been an excellent teacher. And in fact, she got her Associate of Arts degree before she passed, because she was on her road to get her 4-year degree before she was diagnosed with colon cancer and passed a year and a half later. But Your question is so appropriate because so many of the mothers, not taking anything away from my father got up at 6, he was at the barber shop at 7, he did not come home till 9, he worked 14 hours a day, he made 50 cents a head, and he took care of the family. But it was mom who did the teaching beyond what the teachers did in school. I'm not taking anything away from my teachers, but a lot of them just didn't know about the African American experience. They were not taught in college about it. And so what we learned so much about was, I called it the history, or historians call it from the top down, about leaders, great George Washington, Madison, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. We didn't know about Frederick Douglass's response to the Declaration of Independence. Why should we celebrate the Declaration of Independence? None of that was discussed in school during my time. Again, I'm 74 years old and brought up in the 50s and 60s. And what we learned largely about ourselves, the African American experience, we learned from our parents. And that was truly a village, truly people coming together. We learned about it in our churches. And that's why I got 2 books out on the AME church, because you cannot separate a person's experiences from what they do. I mean, you look at historians who write about the Civil War, write about enslavement. They were touched by someone to write about it. And I was touched to write about Florida history from a professor in Georgia. And he said, Larry, I want you to do some research on slavery in Florida. And my first book is about slavery in Florida. I said, Professor Bellamy, there are no instances that I can see of slavery in Florida. He said, it grew pretty fast. I said, no, that's not true, sir. He said, you think you're pretty smart, but you still got a lot of learning to do, young man. And I'm asking you as a senior paper to take a stab at that. You will be very surprised. I said, no, it's not. It's about Disney World. It's about Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth, and that's all. It's nothing else about it. It's about visiting and just having a sunshine good time. He said, you'll find that Florida was very different from what you think about Florida. And after I did the research, my initial paper, I got stuck on Florida. And from that time, from my master's degree at Villanova, my first doctorate at Carnegie Mellon, my second doctorate at the University of London, it was all focused on the institution of slavery. When I was at London, going to the British archives and looking up resources on the international trade. And it was just a great experience for me to have gone there. And I always wanted to do research internationally. And so London provided that, and it was a totally different experience, and it helped to lead to Rebels and Runaways. And in fact, it was my dissertation at the University of London, Rebels and Runaways.
I see. So I want to circle back to Florida, but first, from your mother or your father, did you hear stories about your own family, about your ancestors?
I'm still digging about on stories of my ancestors. Do you know, it's strange. Parents will talk about a lot of other historical events, dates, but they're kind of slow talking about their own experiences, because within their experiences, there have been instances where things weren't very good. And so they talked about it in a limited way. My father grew up in a little place in southwest Georgia called Cuthbert, Georgia. Can trace his lineage back to Cherokee. and enslaved people joining with the Cherokee. My mother can trace her lineage back. She grew up in Macon, Georgia, to Fulton County, early up in Atlanta. But in terms of them really talking about, they talked about their parents, their grandparents, but they didn't go beyond that. And so my family, my siblings are all still researching that. And every family reunion, we come up with more information about our experiences.
I appreciate your response. It really illuminates the importance of oral histories and oral traditions and passing on our histories
absolutely.
in that way, in that manner.
I think oral tradition is very important. I mean, you can tell that what people say orally, they may not have written it down, but it coincides with other written data, so you know that what they're talking about has validity.
Yes.
We cannot throw out the window oral history and the oral tradition. But you know, you have folk who say if it wasn't written, it didn't happen. And I totally reject, that premise. So I think the oral tradition is so important in telling the story of not just African Americans, but Native Americans, gender history, women's history, political history, talking about imperialism and colonialism. It's important in telling the entire story. What I am concerned about today is that how do you teach politically sensitive subjects without offending people, but yet you want to develop critical thinking skills in your students? How do you do that and not upset folk? And I'm concerned that we're pushing a certain history, leaving out various personalities, events, individuals, and that we're pushing one agenda and we're not telling the truth about the total experience. How do we get through that? I respect everyone. But when I talk about enslavement in my classes, I give students an opportunity to express themselves. I said, if you disagree, I said, don't disagree for the sake of disagreeing. Tell me the reason why. And we will respect your response. I say, but this is a part of the development of what later became known as the United States of America. We cannot totally wipe that out. We cannot totally wipe out the experiences between Europeans and indigenous people. We have to talk about that if we want to talk about a holistic history of the American experience. We have to talk about just about a history in its totality.
This is exactly why I loved Rebels and Runaways so much, because I was raised in St. Johns County, and now I've lived about 5.5 years in Gainesville, in like the epicenter of the Second Seminole War. And yet, growing up in school, heard almost nothing about it. And here in Gainesville, it has such little cultural footprint. We have like Payne's Prairie and Noonan's Lake, named after figures from that, but no one talks about it. And so I loved your book's treatment of it. And I guess I want to ask, why do you think both that and the larger history of enslavement in Florida is just so left out of the education system and even left out of popular culture?
I think the history of Florida in general is left out deliberately. Most people have a perception of the third largest state in these United States as a place where you forget about history. Mm-hmm. This is a place where you just enjoy yourself. There are attractions here. There are tourism here, and we can't get into some of the unfortunate aspects of the past. We must continue to look forward. But in my book, Rebels and Runaways, I take the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842 head on. And one of my former students who went on to get his doctorate at Indiana University has written about the Second Seminole War in a more extensive way than I have. And we both like to promote discussion that it was the largest slave rebellion in the South during the antebellum period. And the reason we say that is that and we have found these statistics, over 1,500 free and enslaved blacks joined the Seminoles. And General Jessup said, this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war, because enslaved people knew that if they were caught, they were going back to slavery or go somewhere they would not be free. And many of the white settlers understood that if they couldn't clear out the Seminoles and their black allies, that it would be hard to settle Florida with more Europeans coming in. So that was a war that lasted almost 7 years. And if you looked at the amount of money in today's vernacular, it would be billions to try to put it down. And at the end, they just said, look, we will let you go to Texas, Arizona. We're not going to try to enslave you. Take the blacks with you, going on to Texas. Unlike during Nat Turner's insurrection, where they killed a lot of folk associated with that rebellion with Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser, this was different in that they did not imprison. They said, you can't stay here, but you can go to Texas, you can go to Arizona, you can go to Oklahoma. And so the experience of the Seminoles and blacks, I think, was a different experience in resistance than what occurred during the Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Gabriel Prosser rebellions. So I think it's a subject that still needs a lot of research. I just wanted to open the can of worms to get folk thinking about it, because when you think about Florida, you ask the average student in college, Florida is about tourism. Florida is about beautiful Disney World. Florida is about the aerospace industry. But it's not about the history of the people. It's not about the significance of St. Augustine. It's not about the significance of Pensacola. It's not about why Middle Florida became the hub prior to 1865, because of slavery. 90% of your enslaved people from 1800 to 1865 resided in Middle Florida, Leon County, Gaston County, Jackson County, Jefferson County. All this section was what we call Middle Florida. And Middle Florida produced 90% of all the cotton produced in Florida from 1800 to 1865. And it was that cotton that gave the economic basis for Florida to grow after the Civil War. But we don't talk about that. And I'm not talking about a history where you only talk about minorities and you leave out other groups. I'm talking about history in totality. That's all I want. I'm not for history one way or the other. I teach African American history, but African American history is American history. When I teach African American history, I still teach about Jefferson. I still teach about Washington. I still teach about the Constitution. I still teach about the 3/5 Amendment. I still teach about the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which led to the 14th Amendment and citizenship rights. But that's American history. I just happen to be teaching it with a focus on African American, but I'm not leaving out the total American experience. But we got to get people to understand, to talk about different aspects of history does not mean that you're excluding overall American history. That's never been my objective. And so really, with all the concern about how people teach, I have not modified my classes at all.
Good.
Because I teach history in a way that all groups are represented. Then I give my students an opportunity, because they're going to write in my class, to take any aspect of that in African American history. Well, if you want to write about George Washington, well, what do you want to say? Tell me what you want to do. And 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say, go do it. So students have an opportunity to research. And one thing we must also do when teaching American history or history in general, we got to make history meaningful and interesting to our students. We don't need to be talking such in a way it's so esoteric that they have no idea what the hell we're talking about. I mean, we must tell history as a story, relating individuals to certain places. Don't need to, dates are used as a means to an end, but not an end in themselves. Tell the story and you will make people interested in reading history and taking history as a class, whether it's in high school or in your college or university.
What do you think it means for students, especially African American students and students in Florida, to learn that history, to have it taught to them in a way that's engaging, and especially for students in Florida to learn the history of their state, to learn about...
Excellent question. I think it means that when you are comprehensive in your teaching and you talk about the experience of various ethnic, racial groups, that in particular, African American students feel that, hey, I'm a part of the big picture, that my ancestors had something to do with, not that they had the only thing to do, but that they were a part of the big picture in the making of America. I feel proud about that. Yes, I'm not proud that many of them were enslaved, but as enslaved folk, I just did an article that I hope will be published in the Florida Historical Quarterly, where I talk about enslaved people, your carpenters, your brick masons, who helped to build the first state capitol building in 1824. We're celebrating our bicentennial. I found information. I felt good about that. Not that they were enslaved, but that they were a part of the making of the state capitol in 1824, then again in 1845. You didn't leave out certain individuals. And I think it's the worst thing for a child to hear of the great accomplishments of other groups and hear nothing about his racial or ethnic group. I think you do children a disservice. You turn them off from education. And we must try as scholars, as teachers, whether it's at the University of Florida or Florida A&M, to teach in a comprehensive way where you include the accomplishments, the shortcomings, the weaknesses of all groups, because they made up America and they were instrumental in the making of America. When you do that, I think a lot of this talk about what to include and to exclude in history will become a thing of the past.
Absolutely.
In this, we haven't really talked about Fort Mose in this as a sort of a precursor to a lot of the African American history in Florida.
Yes.
And that's, for me, also something special because I grew up about 30 minutes away from
Isn't that
it. And
something?
I didn't learn about it until I was in my 20s.
Fort Mose is a beautiful history, and we can thank a scholar right here at the University of Florida, Kathy Deegan, for really doing a lot of great work on Fort Mose. Fort Mose, many say, and we're finding new information out every day, but many scholars believe that Fort Mose was the first free black community in 1738. Someone may come up with something different, but it's important to understand Fort Mose and what it stood as. It stood as really a refuge to help the Spanish keep out Oglethorpe and others who were trying to get into Florida, and particularly St. Augustine. But they were great fighters, and they understood the importance of Fort Mose. So I think what they're doing to make it a national site is commendable. And I wish they had called me, and I could have been any way associated with it. It would have been something that I would have loved to have done.
Yeah. And now with the reconstruction of they're trying to reconstruct the fort in where it was, I think that's an incredible way.
It's incredible. It's tremendous.
Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts about how this history could be taught, maybe not just to students, but to people who are no longer in school, who kind of missed that opportunity to learn this history? How can the broader public get engaged in this history?
I think the broader community can get engaged in this history through podcasts, through documentaries. For example, this documentary with me, I don't know if you can use anything that I've said, but documentaries like this one that you can make available to, you're not trying to, I don't believe, make money, but at the same time, you can, let public television know that you have these. These are current right now, and they may be of interest to certain of your viewers. So take a look if you want to, fine if not. I think somehow we gotta get out of the classroom. We gotta get in the community. But again, I think this is something that universities need to work at. For example, at my university, they don't count going in the community as heavily as research. So you got a lot of professors who could take their expertise in the community, could have seminars in the evening, may do some, but not as many as people would like, because they got to spend more time on research and writing. So I think somehow we got to change the tenure requirements that would allow a segment or have different tracks that would allow folk who believe in public history, believe in doing interviews, believe in going out in the community. There should be a track that would allow them to get tenure to continue to do what they like, and that everybody should not be pushed into one track of publish or perish. And I think until we do that, we're going to find it hard getting people to volunteer time other than research time to reach the public. So in lieu of that, you have to have specials on television and scholars coming in and giving their perspective on different aspects of history. Short of that, it's going to be very hard to reach the public.
Yeah, so I'm interested in what the future looks like for you. Is there anything in your book that you plan to explore more, or you said that you have a new article coming out? What does that look like for you as far as publications and?
I'm working on my 10th book that I've either authored or co-authored. And let's focus on Rebels and Runaways. That book was twice the size, but my great press that published it said, look, we got to cut it down. And so one part that I left out that I would like to pursue at some point, but teaching and all this other stuff I got going on just makes it so hard. One aspect I would like to look at is what happened to those escapees who settled in Nassau and other parts of the Bahamas. What was their life like after they settled in? I would like to really search, go to Bahamas, follow their trip or their route, and see just what happened and what happened to the families after. So that's a particular part of Rebels and Runaways that I wished I could have included, although I didn't have a lot of information. I got students working on that, but it is expensive for some of them to go and do that kind of research over in the Bahamas. So I am still hoping that a student will take that on as a dissertation. I'm working on 2 books now, one on with my colleague, Dr. Canna Brown, on a bishop of the AME Church who helped to spread the Methodist religion, African Methodism, throughout the South, particularly in Texas and other places. We're about through, well, it depends on me to get the rest of it done. I just need to do it. But one thing that I really hope is that we can come together as a country and look at history as a way of telling the stories of different people over time, change over time. People who acted one way in the 1800s don't necessarily act that way today. But you got to give students an opportunity to explore, to critically think about different eras in history, different periods. And until we're able to do that, I just don't think America today is comfortable with its history. And so therefore it wants to pick and choose what history to tell at the expense of not telling the total truth about the American experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a perfect place to wrap up.
Yes, I really appreciate you giving us the time to just, tell us your story. This has been really fantastic.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
You think it's okay?
Yes, I think so. I thought it was great.
Thank you. I said it all from the heart because I've been teaching and I've taught, white, black, Indian, and none of them has said that I was cruel because I give everybody an opportunity to participate.
Yeah.
But again, the way that we have some of these classes where you have 400 students, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right.
So are we doing our students an injustice to have those larger classes where they can't ask one question because there's just too many?
Right.
That's just the way that we set up things, I think we need to take another look at in order to do things like teaching history more effectively. We need to do that better. If we don't, I don't know where history is going to end. I mean, you got folk who don't want to teach history at all unless it's a particular type of history.
Yep.
And that's just not being truthful to the overall American experience, I think.
Well, I hope this interview is one step in the right direction.
Well, I hope you can use at least 2 minutes of something.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Yes, yes, yes.